Senior Manager of Programs here at Oatlands. On behalf of all of us here, it's my pleasure to welcome you today. Oatlands is on the ancestral lands of the Manahoac and the Piscataway, and other nations who we're still learning about their history. Oatlands is also was a site of enslavement. It had the dubious distinction of being the largest plantation in Loudoun County at the start of the Civil War, both in land and enslaved people. The Carter family owned Oatlands through the late 1890s, and then sold it to the they sold it to somebody in between. He didn't do much here. And then in 1903, we don't really talk about this, but 1903, sold it to the prominent and wealthy Eustis family from Washington, D.C. This was their country home. And as I said, that is the family who donated the property to the National Trust in 1965. And so our mission is to tell a full and accurate history here at the property. And so what I encourage you to do is, once we reopen again to the public on March 29th, the mansion will be open for public tours again. I encourage you to come on back and visit the site and take a tour. And like our aim to tell a full and accurate history, today's speaker is doing the same thing. Something just didn't feel right to Barbara about how historians have categorized Eliza Monroe Hay over the years. And so Barbara literally dug into the story, and she's here to tell us about that today. Her talk is the first in our series of winter talks. We have another one coming up on February 8th, also with a connection to President Monroe, and that is about what happened to the people he enslaved, what happened to them after his death. And today's talk and that talk also are part of a broader series of VA250 and Loudoun 250, the commemoration of our country's Revolutionary War. And the talk today and our other talks coming up are made possible by a grant from the VA250 Commission in partnership with Virginia Humanities. James Monroe in two minutes and 3 PowerPoint slides. So a really, a timeline that doesn't even highlight everything about our 5th president, James Monroe. He served in the Revolutionary War. He had held a whole bunch of political offices: Minister to France, he was Secretary of State, temporarily Secretary of War, he was governor, and then he became our 5th president in 1817, serving through 1825. And during this time period, up until then, he married Elizabeth Courtright Monroe. They had 3 children. Sadly, their son, James Spencer, died in infancy at about the age of 1. In addition to owning land in Loudoun County, he also owned land in Albemarle County and elsewhere, but in Albemarle County in his plantation there was called Hylas. And then after he retired from the presidency, he made Oak Hill his home. And as this last bullet point down here is something that Emily Stanfield will talk about on February 8th. President Monroe died in 1831, but his estate wasn't inventoried until 1836, a lapse of 5 years. And she's going to talk about what happened to the about 36 enslaved people who were at Oak Hill when President Monroe died. And here's his family: James Monroe, Elizabeth Courtright, and then his daughter Eliza, who Barbara's going to talk about today, and his oldest daughter, and Mariah, his youngest daughter, and Samuel Gubner, her husband, is going to come into play actually in both talks that we're going to have. And so now, one more slide. This is a picture of the exterior of Oak Hill. You see a little bit of the terrace gardens there in the front. 2 of the rooms. It's been privately owned. It's always been privately owned, but the family owning it, who has owned it for the past many, many decades, have been just fabulous stewards of this property. Some of you might have been there over the years because they opened it periodically for Garden Week, but it's just an absolutely beautiful property. And like I said, we all have high hopes for it becoming a state park just down the road from us. And so what I'm going to do now is turn it over to Barbara.
Been in the Monroe women particularly, and Eliza's story
Then
I was hooked, and so now, almost 6 years later, it took about 5 years, 5.5 years of research into her life. There wasn't much written. A little handful of sentences of some Monroe biographies was all I had really that had been printed. So I had to go to primary sources. And I've got to tell you, that was new territory for me. I'm not really a historian. You know, I was an educator, but I hadn't really gone through, you know, boxes of wills up to my elbows and moldy old wills and things, you know, before. It was all new. But I had a lot of help with this project from some wonderful archivists and historians who helped me. So anyway, that's how I got interested in the story of Eliza, and I think you will find it interesting as well. It's not at all how it was reported. It was very different, and that's why I wanted to write the book and tell her story, because it's very different than what had been written about her before. Oh, I do want to say, please feel free to ask questions as we go. I'm happy to have, you know, discussion as we go along in your comments and things, so I welcome that.
Have you been to her grave and told her you've redeemed her reputation?
We're trying to do one better. So at the end of this presentation, this has led to a campaign to repatriate her remains. And that, after a year and a half of working on that, that's set to happen. So I'll tell you about that. This is the expectation for the approval of that just came a few days ago from the United States Embassy in Paris. So it's pretty exciting news. But thank you for your question. So basically, I think I already told you what we're going to talk about today, Eliza's story, and about some of the hidden documents that were found, and the repatriation. The Monroes had a residence in Fredericksburg, and as Lori mentioned, they also had their home here in Loudoun County. Eliza was born just outside of Fredericksburg in King George County. The house was ready for the Monroes to live in Fredericksburg, but it wasn't quite ready yet. They were doing some work on it, so Eliza was born before they could move in. But at about the age of 2 months or so, they were able to get into that house. It's at 301 Caroline Street, still there in Fredericksburg. I see nodding. And the early years of her life were spent in Fredericksburg while James Monroe practiced law. That was his first law practice there in Fredericksburg. These are some other places that Eliza lived. And you see most of them are in Virginia. The ones in New York and Baltimore at the bottom, she only lived in those places after she had been widowed, after her husband died. So in New York, she was living with her sister, Mariah, and her husband, Samuel Gouverneur, and then in Baltimore for a time with her daughter and her family. But otherwise, she was a Virginia girl. During her young years, from about the age of starting at about age 5, 6, 7 in there, she was educated in Paris, so she had a very good education. James Monroe made 2 trips to Europe. The first one was 1794 to 1797, when President Washington appointed him minister to France. Monroe always traveled with his family, so his wife and children were with him. At that time, he only had 1 child, that first trip, Eliza. So she went with the family, and she was enrolled in a very prestigious boarding school. We'll get to that in one moment. The second trip to Europe was as minister to Spain, France, and Great Britain, so he was a busy man. And at that time, they had 2 children, but Eliza was a teenager, and then her sister, Mariah, was a babe in arms, 11 months old, when they boarded that ship and went across the Atlantic, you know, like this, for a month with a baby. So her mother was really tough. But that second trip, she finished her education at the boarding school. She was also schooled at home by her mother and father in some in-between years there. She was at Madame Campan's school. Anyone familiar with Madame Campan's school? Madame Campan had been lady-in-waiting to Marie Antoinette. we know what happened to the poor Marie Antoinette. And afterwards, Madame Caron, who was very well educated as well, she opened her own boarding school. Some of Eliza's classmates were Caroline Bonaparte, you know, so it was definitely a school for the elites. And it was a boarding school. And Eliza made friendships there that continued through her life. One of the young friends she had, actually her best friend there at the school, was Hortense de Beauharnais. And Hortense de Beauharnais, I go into it more in the book, in the research, because their friendship, I think, is really important to Eliza's story for a lot of ways, in a lot of ways. But I just want to mention that the portrait on the left, am I in your way, people up here? The portrait on the left is the actual watercolor on ivory that we have at Highland that Hortense de Beauharnais gave to Eliza when she was that age. So she's about 12 in that portrait. And, you know, they didn't have school photos to swap, you know, so this hand-painted portrait was given to Eliza. And as a special sign of their friendship, Hortense put a lock of her hair in the back of the frame, and we have that as well. And then on the right is a picture of her as an adult. One reason the relationship of the two girls was important in Eliza's story is because Hortense's father had been guillotined during the French Revolution, and her mother in Paris got to know a pretty famous guy. You may have heard of him, Napoleon. Her mother was Josephine. So now, in later years when the girls were growing up, Hortense was growing up in Europe, and her mother marries Napoleon and becomes her mother's empress, and he's emperor. And on this side of the Atlantic, Eliza grows up, and her father becomes, you know, governor of Virginia 4 times, Secretary of State, Secretary of War, and president. So it was kind of interesting, the parallels there in the two girls' stories. But their letters back and forth gave me a lot of information about Eliza. And those primary sources were just wonderful. This is a really important point in Eliza's life. I don't want to be in anyone's way. Am I going? Okay, thank you. Because when the Monroes returned to America in 1807, there was a lot of hoopla about this return. A lot had been accomplished by Monroe during that time. For example, what became the Louisiana Purchase was negotiated at that time. So when they arrived back in Virginia, there were military honors, there were receptions. Eliza was about 20 years old, almost 21 at the time. And I think this was a pivotal moment for her. I think that she really understood at this point her father's standing in this country. Of course, she knew Thomas Jefferson because they were neighbors at the Albemarle plantation, and she knew the Madisons. But at this point, seeing all of this respect for her father, I think it impressed upon her, and she had to be wondering at this point in her life, what does this mean for me? You know, it just had to be an exciting time for her. A year after the return, she married the rather dashing, I think, George Hay. He was a prominent district attorney in Virginia. He had prosecuted Aaron Burr for treason, so had made a name for himself.
Guys get prosecuted.
He was 22 years older than Eliza. She was 22. He was 44. He was older than her mother, but younger than her father. But their letters are just their relationship, I think, was just wonderful. He always wrote of her in very fond terms. Even in his last will and testament, she is referred to as my dear Eliza, my dear wife. I mean, it just was a wonderful relationship, I think. And then they had a child born the following year, 1809, named Hortensia. Where'd you get that name from? Yeah, after Hortense de Beauharnais. Some people thought that was a little uppity, you know, on her, but yeah, whatever. I think it's lovely. So their daughter was named Hortensia, and Hortense de Beauharnais was her godmother as well. For the next 8 years, Eliza was managing a It's no longer there. It was on the Chickahominy River about 7 miles from Richmond. And the Monroes gave that plantation to Eliza and her husband George as a wedding present. So Eliza did not have the experience in matters of state and being a wife of a politician during those 8 years. She was raising her daughter and taking care of the house and doing things that you would to run the plantation. In a moment, we'll see how that maybe made things a little bit more difficult for Eliza during Monroe's presidency. Monroe had become Secretary of State and Secretary of War. To this day, the only man to hold 2 cabinet positions at the same time. And that was during the War of 1812, so he was a really busy man. And then he became president in 1817 and served 2 terms till 1825. The bottom line there is really important as far as Eliza goes. During these 8 years, her mother's health had declined significantly. And she was not going to be able to carry on the duties of First Lady as Dolly Madison had. So anyone familiar with Dolly's social agenda? She was a real social butterfly. Everybody come in, you know, the White House, come on in. She was forever taking people cakes and putting them on china plates and then always telling them, keep the plate. So all over the country there are people with plates from Dolly Madison. And I met a man who had a cup and saucer from an ancestor who had tea with Dolly Madison, and she said, oh, keep the cup and saucer. So I don't know what that was about, but anyway. Elizabeth Monroe was not going to be doing those kinds of things. And that turned out to be very important for Eliza's story. During the years, White House years, Mrs. Monroe had 2 main issues with her health. One was the arthritis, which she was bedridden part of the time with that, but she also had epilepsy. Of course, it wasn't called that in those days, but called the falling sickness, but the descriptions of the episodes, the sudden collapse, the convulsions, that kind of thing, we know it to be epilepsy. And that's something I believe in my research, there's evidence that the Monroes, of course, would not want that witnessed. And I believe that was part of the reason for reining in the social obligations of the First Lady. And you can see why that would be important. So they changed the protocols from easy access to the president and his family to a more structured etiquette, much like the European etiquette of the day. And that was what the public thought in Washington. The Washington elites sort of, it really, they did not like this at all. They thought they were being shut out. They were saying that Mrs. Monroe didn't want to mingle with people, you know, that kind of thing. Though they worked on changing them for these reasons, which I believe we've already gone over, but mainly to keep Mrs. Monroe from overexerting herself and also from having her conditions be observed. And Washington society was like, everything exploded. The press went crazy. They dubbed Mrs. Monroe, her name Elizabeth, they gave her Queen Elizabeth. So a lot of things were really, they were getting a lot of unfavorable press during those especially during the first year of the first term. Eliza moved her family into the White House to help her mother with the duties. But as you recall, she didn't have the experience that her mother had of already being in the position of the wife of someone who is dealing with dignitaries and congressmen and that kind of thing. Eliza was only 31 at this time, but she stepped up and moved in with her family. Her husband was often traveling as a district attorney, so he wasn't always there. But Eliza was stepping in as best she could, and Washington elites, they didn't like that either. I believe they felt snubbed. You know, they would show up at the White things got a whole lot worse when Eliza planned the wedding of her younger sister, Mariah. Mariah was 15 years younger than Eliza. No letter has ever been found that I know of, or historians know of, between the two sisters. Eliza was 15, when she was born, and so with that distance in age, Mariah was playing with dolls and tea sets when Eliza was running her own plantation. So it's my opinion from what I've read that there wasn't a real close relationship between the girls. Add to that for the first 2 years of the presidency, Mariah was still in school. She was finishing her school at Madame Berlaud's in Philadelphia, another French woman who opened a boarding school. And she didn't get to the White House until 1819. She was 19 years old. And Eliza had already been running things basically for 2 years. So now the younger sister arrives. There had to be a little bit of difficulty there with that adjustment. Add to that she fell in love, Mariah, with one of Monroe's private secretaries who was her mother's nephew, and then, Monroe's nephew as well, but related through her mother. And they wanted to get married. So they wanted to get married in 1820 in the White House. And the mother Elizabeth was not up to the task, so Eliza started the planning. She wanted it to be very small, maybe just 40 people max, close family, maybe a few close friends, and that was it. Well, people went crazy. I mean, for some reason, the people in Washington, congressmen and all, they thought they should be invited. So a compromise was reached that the ceremony would be small, and there would be 3 large receptions afterwards. And that way everybody who wanted to participate could come participate. So everybody was happy for a very brief time because this did not go as planned. Because during the first reception, there was an altercation between Decatur and Barron. And the next morning they had a duel. And that's when Commodore Stephen Decatur died. So now Washington is reeling from this because Decatur was a huge military hero. And so the other receptions were canceled. So now you've got 2 receptions worth of people who are upset again because they couldn't, it's not Eliza's fault. Eliza was still catching the brunt of all of this. And in summary, for all of these reasons, I think this all contributed to Eliza just catching this criticism, just right and left. It seemed to be relentless. The newspaper articles and things I read, it was really, really quite uncanny. And then, of course, the last thing there, she's her good friend. When people found out her good friend is the stepdaughter of Napoleon, that did not go over well. We had fought wars over this, trying to get away from royal, influence and things like that. So, people weren't too sure about that friendship. So it was just I think it was a combination of things. An unfavorable reputation stuck to Eliza, and it just seemed to get bigger and bigger and bigger over the years. So you start out with John Quincy Adams, Monroe's Secretary of State, saying she's an obstinate firebrand. And then, you get to the 1900s and even into 2000, she had a high opinion of herself, and then, Jack Mitchell, beep. I mean, you can't, wow, like, how did you get from, she was a firebrand to, I don't know. So, anyway, all of this it was just kind of rubbing me the wrong way. I'm like, what is going on? So that was another reason I really wanted to find out about her, more about her. The basic narrative I found, and this is in all the Monroe major biographies, especially the later ones, Ammon and the Younger, and also the latest Tim McGrath, this sort of sums it up, that she was obstinate, she had an argument with her family near the end of her life, and she just abandoned family and country and everybody and just went off to live and die in Paris. And I said, I'm out of here. And that didn't make sense to me because I'm a grandmother. And when she went to Paris, she was a grandmother. And I knew, any grandmothers in here? Because you couldn't pay me enough. I don't care who I argued with. I'm not getting on a boat and abandoning everybody and going off to die someplace. I mean, I was like, that can't be right. So that was another thing that really started the research into her life. So as I have there, but the evidence points to a whole different Eliza. And I have to tell you too that I dug and dug. I looked for examples of these things that people were saying about her. I looked to see, how was she obstinate? What did she do that was so much a firebrand, as John Quincy Adams said? You know, I was following up on what people had said, and I could not find examples. I could not find, you know, did she throw a chair? I mean, you know, what did she, I couldn't find it. I couldn't even find, like, and then she said such and such to so and so. So that made me suspicious too. And the evidence I found pointed out that she had these qualities. She was extraordinarily devoted to her family. She was an amazing nurse, and we'll get into that in a minute. She demonstrated a lot of strength and fortitude and had a sense of duty to her family and her country. Let's talk about nursing the sick first. Everyone was calling on Eliza to come and take care of their children, to help out relatives and friends alike. And she nursed the sick during 2 epidemics during Monroe's presidency. And she took care of her mother for the last 13 years of her life, of her mother's life. She nursed her father. After her mother died, her father was very grieved, and he said, I don't think I'll last long, and he died 9.5 months later from tuberculosis. And Eliza took care of him through that whole time. She took care of her daughter as well. So it's really, this, to me, this does not say somebody who is haughty and obstinate and aloof. You know, you're not working with epidemic victims if you're, you know, if you think you're too good for that. I mean, do you know what I'm saying? So it was really interesting. I just kept getting more and more interested in this because I'm like, okay, so what's going on? What's the real story? It was quite fascinating. And I'd like to give you just quickly a couple examples, concrete examples of her nursing ability. John Calhoun, who was Monroe's Secretary of War, sadly had lost a child. One of his children were very young. And then another one got sick. And Eliza went to the home to take care of the child. Well, it was during the planning time for Mariah's wedding. And so Mrs. Calhoun said, you know, you're busy, you know, thank you, but oh no, we don't want to. And Monroe stepped in and said, she's the best nurse you can have for your child. Please let her come. And she went 4 nights and stayed up with the child and helped take care of that child. And it just was quite remarkable to me to learn these things. The other one I want to mention is when Eliza saved her mother's life at Oak Hill. After the Monroes retired from public life at the end of his presidency, they moved into the Oak Hill plantation, and her mother was quite ill by that time, and Eliza moved her family there as well to help take care of her mother. And the Monroes had had breakfast. This was 1826. They had had breakfast in the morning, and Monroe had left in a carriage. He was always keeping his finger into politics, you know, so he was off on some, doing whatever, Richmond or someplace. And a little while later, one of the enslaved came to Eliza and said he had heard a ruckus upstairs in the bedroom, and he was worried about his mistress. He was worried about Elizabeth Monroe. So Eliza flew up the stairs and found her mother collapsed in a burn burning fireplace. She had had a seizure. She was convulsing at the time. She had been stabbed in the torso by one of the andirons as she fell. She was unconscious and burned over a third of her body. Eliza took care of her, and she survived. That's quite remarkable even today. If you're burned over a third of your body, that's risky. Your life, that's risky. Monroe wrote that Mrs. Monroe was unconscious for 10 days following that. The cure might have had something to do with that because Mrs. Monroe was given, and this is according to James Monroe, I've read his letter about it, 250 drops of laudanum they were giving her a day. You know what laudanum is? It's opium.
Yeah.
And you cut it with alcohol, use brandy. 250 drops, that's an extraordinary dose because from what I found, the standard dose would have been maybe 12 or 14 drops a day. But she got through it. In fact, she recovered so well that a year or two later, she went to visit Mariah and her grandchildren in New York. So, you know, incredible. A nurse came to Highland one day, and I was telling her this episode, and she said, we need to find out what Eliza did. What was she applying to the burns area? How did she manage this? It would be quite remarkable to find out. She also demonstrated strength and fortitude on a number of occasions, but one of them particularly is when her daughter died. She had one surviving child, and that was Hortensia, and she died young at the age of 25, a few months after the birth of her third child. And Emily Stanfield, actually, who's coming to speak next month, she found this is the only death notice we know of Hortensia, and it changed history as well because the date of her death had been in the historical record is 1839, and it was not. It was 1834, and I think that's really important to Eliza's story because I believe from the evidence I collected that Eliza stayed at her daughter's home and raised those grandchildren for 4 years after that, and that had never been known. And I can place her residence, for example, at the time she applied for a passport in 1838, her residence was listed as Baltimore. So when her husband had died, she went to live with her sister in New York, as I mentioned. But at this time, these 4 years, I believe she was in Baltimore. Her sense of duty to family and country on Monroe's deathbed, he dictated the manumission of his enslaved manservant, Peter Marks. And Eliza saw that through. It was about a 1.5 year process, but she made that happen. As I mentioned, she helped her mother during the presidency, and I believe she stayed at Oak Hill for 4 years to take care of her children. Are there any questions up to now? I haven't seen any hands. But yes?
What were those epidemics that tore through Washington during that?
The only one I could find what exactly specifically was malaria. One was malaria. Yeah, that's very serious. But you know, Washington was just like, it was horrible then. Muddy streets and the wind, the summers were just horrible. Now, Eliza also had a sense of humor. And this is, in 5 years, this is the only example of her having a sense of humor, so I gotta tell you about it. No one reported that, but I think it's really funny. Some of you might think it's rather tasteless, but anyway, I think it's, I just think it's hysterical. She was at a function in the drawing room in the president's house in the White House, and her husband was off, you know, with his work. So he was fine, he just wasn't present. But everyone was coming up to her saying, where's Mr. Hay? How's Mr. Hay? Is Mr. Hay okay? And finally she had just had enough of this, and she blurted out, he's dead! I'm quoting exactly here. He's dead! And he's dead and very some faces in the room. I know. Anyway, another side of her. So this is one of the best descriptions of Eliza that I found. Louisa Catherine Adams was the wife of John Quincy Adams. And if I may, I'd like to read this. This woman is made up of so many great and little qualities, so full of agreeables and disagreeables. She's so accomplished and so ill-bred. She has so much sense and so little judgment. She's so proud and so mean, I scarcely ever met such a compound. Oh, that could be said of all of us, I guess. But anyway. So I came to the conclusion that maybe Eliza was a woman ahead of her time. So in an era when women were expected to be demure and, could just go along with things and, not blurt out, my husband's dead. She dared to speak her mind. She was obviously intelligent. Within a month of her husband's death, she had put up the plantation for sale and his will was in probate. I mean, she just got it done. When she moved into the White House, she may have been a little brusque with folks from what I found, but she was managing it. She was doing what her mother would have done. And she just stepped in with very little experience and just charged ahead. And I think those are the kinds of qualities we admire today in women, but in those days, they probably were not looked upon so fondly. I do want to mention something else that she went through, and I think it maybe had been on the slide, and I forgot to mention it, that Eliza lost 3 family members in a short amount of time. So September, she was taking care of her mother, as I mentioned, at Oak Hill in 1830, and her husband was ill at the same time. He had gone for treatment, and then on the way back, he was at White Sulphur Springs, and on the way back to Oak Hill, he became too ill to travel anymore. They pulled off at the Clark home in Albemarle County, and a message was sent to Eliza to come as quickly as you can. She started to travel, but she did not get there before he died. So he died on September 21st, 1830, before she could get to him. While she's taking care of his body, she gets a message that her mother's dying back at Oak Hill. So she starts to travel back and didn't make it there either. Before her mother died, 2 days after her husband. Now I should say, one Monroe biographer, Harry Ammon, which is a very well respected biography, he said that she made it back with her husband's body in tow about just a couple hours before her mother died. But the other biographies say that she died before she got there. Either way, within 2 days, she's lost her husband and her mother, and then 9.5 months later, she lost her father. So part of her strength and fortitude that I saw is that the way in all of these occasions, she just kept moving forward and doing what needed to be done. This is just some other researchers who back up this idea of the expectations of women in this era, and I think they tie in with Eliza and how maybe what she was doing was just misinterpreted or seen as being bossy when she's really just trying to do the job. So now we're up to 1838. So if she's taking care of her grandchildren for 4 years, she was advised to take a sea voyage to improve her health. That is in one of her letters. So those are her words. And I don't know the nature of the illness, but typically when people are advised to take a sea voyage, it's for something with their lungs. She had significant exposure to tuberculosis by this time. So you got to wonder if maybe that was kicking up. But she arrived in, my best estimate based on her letters, in early December 1838. While she was there, she was struggling to make ends meet. And this is a real concern for me, and it also drew me into her research. How could the daughter of a president and James Monroe, who had property, and I know it's often reported that he was in debt when he died. Actually, he was solvent, so nothing had to be sold when he died. Not that there was cash laying around, but he had a lot of property and he had some papers. And in his last will and testament, he appointed an executor to sell those things and divide the estate evenly between the two sisters. But now, in 1838, it's been 7 years, and Eliza has not gotten 1 cent, and that is from her letter, well, not 1 cent of her inheritance, and she's struggling. Yes?
Who is she writing the letters to?
Oh. Thank you for asking. We set that up ahead of time. She wrote to people like King Louis Philippe of France, and also the Tsar of Russia, Nicholas I. I believe, and I explain it, that why I think she had connections to these people. Some people might think, wow, that's pretty uppity. And maybe it was a little bit, but through her friendships, like with Hortense de Beauharnais and other people in Europe, she had some connections here, plus she was just desperate. She needed help.
So you explained that she was assertive when it was not acceptable, and then you said she was told to go on an ocean voyage for her health. And then she's needing help because she's not receiving money. Maybe the ocean voyage suggestion was their way of asking her to go away.
You know what? You're the second person who has come to that. And how far should I go with this?
You're on your time now.
I tried to, what I have tried to do is report my research and allow readers to come to conclusions on, their own conclusions without putting too much of my stuff in there. But I will say that I share that view. I don't have a statement about that. I don't have a document that says that. But when documents are pulled together, it certainly implies that that there was a reason they were trying to get her out of the way.
They being who?
Specifically, her brother-in-law. So Mariah's husband. He had been appointed executor of Monroe's will. He held the purse strings. And she never got a cent. And a lot of my research was on that because Eliza wrote in her letters, she wrote exactly what he had done. Mr. G, she called him, SG, Mr. G. And she wrote very specifically, and when I read those, I was stunned, absolutely stunned. Even accusations that he had deliberately, Samuel Gouverneur had, she was taking care of Monroe at his house with Mariah. So Eliza wrote that Samuel Gouverneur had deliberately delayed taking the dictation of Monroe's will, that he had even placed people around him to keep him occupied and busy, so that when he dictated his will, Eliza felt that it was not what he would have written. Here's a man who had been president, okay? He had been a lawyer. He had property. His will was 5 short sentences.
Ooh.
5 short sentences. And the property was to be divided evenly between the 2 sisters. And the papers, the sale of his papers and autobiography, that was to be divided 3 ways. This is how the will states it. 1/3 for Eliza, who's a widow by now, 1/3 for Mariah, and 1/3 for Samuel Gouverneur for being executor. So now you've got the couple, Mariah and Samuel, who are getting 2/3 of that, and Eliza, who's a widow, getting 1/3. In addition, there is a sentence where Monroe is asking Samuel Gouverneur to take Eliza under his wing and support her. So Eliza wrote out a lot of details, but due diligence required that I research that. I actually researched, another 20 years after through Samuel Gubner's, the end of his life and past, because I wanted to see if the examples that Eliza gave in her letters, and the letters are transcribed for you in the book, if he was really doing those activities. So then I had to dig through newspapers and court documents and things like that, which I found quite fascinating. I must be a real history geek, but anyway, I found it really interesting to read court transcripts. I don't scare myself sometimes. But I wanted to be sure because even though Eliza wrote it, and that's a primary source and those are her words, I would not damage a man's reputation without knowing for sure whether the man be dead or alive, unless I knew for sure that that is what happened and I can prove it. So I can place him, for example, on a certain day at the racetrack and the high stakes betting that he's doing, and Eliza's still not got a dime. So there were a lot of things here in America going on. 3 months after that judgment, the signature of Mariah is on a sale of property from. It's a sale of property from Oak Hill for $25,000, and I think that was specifically for the fine, to help pay the fine, and she signed it. Eliza never got any of that, and I believe Eliza knew about that because it was after that sale, it was about 6 weeks later when she wrote her last letter, and she was so desperate. I think at that point she knew that she was never going to get a cent, and she's stuck in Paris, and she's in debt, and she's sick, and she's going to die there. So really tragic.
Barbara had a comment.
But I don't know how much Mariah knew. I don't know, he may have said, oh yeah, and after the sale, I'll send half to your sister. Mariah, in my research of her, I think she was just trying to get along. I think she was just trying to get through it. There's evidence that, their marriage, the son said, Mariah's and Samuel's son said that Mariah had to hide the silverware because his father would sell it. There's that kind of stuff. So, yes.
In Emily Stanfield's article, she suggests that the money he got for selling the slaves to Louisiana, that Gubner got,
Yes.
that he used that to pay the fine for the postmaster job.
Yes.
Because he got $25,000 for that fine.
Yes. I believe that was not a coincidence. I think that was paid for that. Yeah, and Emily and I had corresponded about that. Emily found that document, that bill of sale. And it was in New Orleans. And what's interesting to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, Roy, but that was never filed in Loudon. A copy of that was never filed in the Loudon. It was only hiding in an archives in New Orleans, which also is, I think, kind of fishy. Yes.
I'm really struck by how sticky the narrative that has prevailed for so long hadn't been kind of debunked like you've been doing sooner. Number one, and I wonder if it's related to how the public perceives the children of presidents with kind of a bias that may not be the most favorable.
Yes, it is interesting, and how that persisted for almost 200 years, that narrative. I get it, that in the Monroe biographies, the children are peripheral to the story, so the story isn't about them, it's about Monroe. And usually a good nod is given to his wife, but the children haven't been focused on it. And then it seems no one just got interested in Eliza's story or it didn't seem odd to them or something. But you can see how once I started, there was just more stuff. There was just more layers to this. It was like a detective story, trying to figure out what happened and how she died penniless. But now we know. Okay, I'm gonna zip a little bit here. We're almost to the end. This is one of my favorite quotes from a letter, Eliza's last letter that I know of. Much of human life, my friend, is spent in lamentation and in inaction, but that's not my character. I will do all I can to sustain myself, and if I fail, I can only feel I have done my best. And 3 months later, she was dead. Now, Eliza was buried, fortunately, by a Stafford County man, Daniel Brent. He had been in the working as chief clerk of the Secretary of State during Monroe's presidency. Now he had become a consul in Paris, and Eliza's name came across his desk as an American who died in Paris. He must have been shocked, but he knew that name. So he arranged for her funeral. This is a daguerreotype of a funeral at Père Lachaise Cemetery in 1840. So I was quite amazed to find it. But that is likely not her procession because her procession was very simple. And Daniel Brent arranged her funeral mass. I did also find confirmation, the only confirmation we have, a document from Paris, a church there, that she had converted to Catholicism later in life. So he arranged the funeral mass for her and a burial at Père Lachaise. He paid out of pocket, by the way, good man, and took care of everything. He did write to the Secretary of State at that time that he was expecting, hopefully some reimbursement from family, but I never found a record. I looked through the following years' worth of documents to see if that was noted, and it was not in the consular records. So I think he did it quietly. He maybe got reimbursement from some family members. He wrote to, as I said, Secretary of State. But he talks about the procession not being correspondent with the station and position of the lady. So he very well knew who she was. Now, he made an inventory of her effects, and this is key because up until this time, as I mentioned, it had been thought that she willingly intended to live out her life and die, and we couldn't prove otherwise, or die in Paris, but we couldn't prove otherwise, but the inventory did. But the inventory was part of the consular records that had been misfiled for 200 years in the National Archives, so they had never been seen before, and I can't tell you how happy I was when I found them. I immediately called up Scott Ayers and, the James Monroe Museum, and people, I'm like, have you seen these? It was amazing. So we met, so he wanted to use the inventory, of course, to go through their collection as well and see if anything matched. But the reason the inventory was so important is that all Eliza had when she died were 2 traveling trunks. She had not set up house. She had been almost a year and a half in Europe at that time. She had not set up house. She is listed as a rentier in the building, and that's a document from the Paris archives. She had clothing, she had some jewelry, she had some hair pieces, shawls, lace caps, things like that. Not one household furniture. She didn't even have a candle holder or an oil lamp. It was just, like I said, just a traveler. And so to me, that sealed the deal. Now that's my interpretation of this. Some people might think otherwise, I don't know. But to me, this clearly says she did not ever intend to live there. I think she was traveling as if she intended to come home. And that led to a campaign to repatriate her remains because, I thought, what do Americans do in this situation? She's in an unmarked grave in Père Lachaise Cemetery away from home. We bring the remains home. And, sorry. I think her situation happened to a lot of women from that time period. And I think if we can make it right for one, if we can make it right for Eliza, I think it's important to bring her back. So for a year and a half, we've been working on that. And this sort of mentions your question about you know, who started that legend and how did it get started? This is my little teaser, but
Sibling rivalry or something else?
who knows? So we've already talked about this. Oh, I should say, one other thing came up in my research, that she may have been shunned by the family due to her conversion to Catholicism. That's possible. This is the document from the church. It's all in French. And that's the church where her funeral was held. It looks the same as it did in the day. So this is a modern picture, and it's still taken by a good friend who helped me with my research in Paris and found that document for me at the church. So, here we are. As far as the repatriation goes, we've got some exciting news to share. We do, and this is Sue Henderson. She graciously offered to help with fundraising to bring Eliza's remains back. She is on the Board of Regents for the James Monroe Museum and a history event planner in the Fredericksburg area, and it's just been an amazing help for me because I had no idea how to go about that. I was like, we need to bring Eliza home. What do I do? I had no idea. So the plan is for, well, that's what, yeah, we're going to say.
Well, let's give you just a really fast, brief update. We have another friend, Catherine Willis, who had received, well, the James Monroe Foundation had received a letter in French from Père Lachaise Cemetery around 2015, 2016, saying, we have this empty grave and it's sort of fallen apart, and what are you guys going to do about it? She seems to be yours. And Catherine happens to be fluent in French, and she was able to translate that for the James Monroe Museum, and happens to have a son that lives there and was on her way to visit. So she said, I'll go to the cemetery, I'll try to find it. She did find the mistakenly labeled one that Père Lachaise was writing about, but then she found the proper one at Père Lachaise Cemetery and was able to enlist a whole bunch of Americans there in Paris to help clean it up and prepare it and get it in a state where it's at least respectable and known. There was no inscription. It was basically a pauper's grave. Daniel Brent had put it there at, at his own cost, and there was only so much he could do. But we have identified it, exactly where it is, and Catherine paid to have a ceramic monument put on top that is comparable to what else is there from that era. In that regard, then, it started to become, it was a two-sided thing. Scott Harris over at James Monroe knew that there was research being done about Eliza and knew that somebody had just gone over there and put the two together, and now there's a group of 4 of us. We have a wonderful ops person who doesn't come out that much, but anyway, the 4 of us are now really working to bring back Eliza. What we do know is that there is a family plot at Hollywood Cemetery in Richmond, and right now there are 3 graves. You have Mariah, you have Elizabeth, and you have James on 3 different points, and there's a 4th spot just sitting there empty, and Hollywood Cemetery has said, absolutely, you can put her there if you can get her back. So this became a real, I'm not kidding, this woman is a saint, because the first requirement they had was they wanted permission and one spokesperson for every descendant of Eliza Monroe. Every living descendant now. So she researched, I don't know, a couple hundred people came down from that one. And just about the time we thought, thank goodness we had it all translated professionally into French. It's been quite an ordeal. French bureaucracy, that's all I'm going to say. And so they ended up then coming back and saying, oh, no, we need the descendants of the person who bought it. So here you have Daniel Brent of Stafford County, who did not have children, and his estate went to his brother, who had 12 children. So those 12 children, now we're talking about 500-600 people of living descendants have to be researched. Every last one of them has to send proof of who they are, proof of their descendancy, and acceptance that they are fine with this. So now we're up to 600, 700, 800 people have been researched by Barbara. And we've had to find a professional genealogist, and everything has to be officially, professionally translated. They won't just let someone who knows French do it. Yeah. So they've been quite a bear. So we were able to enlist the assistance, and we were so grateful, of the American Embassy, the consul in Paris, who has been able to put a little tiny pressure here and there once in a while, and we literally just found out this week that the embassy has been told the approval is forthwith. We have not been told. We'll see how that comes, but we should.
Well, they said the consul
Right.
general and the deputy consul general of the United States Embassy sat personally with the director of cemeteries for Paris. And so I got that email just a few days ago.
Let's all hold our breaths.
That after a lengthy conversation, so I don't know what was involved in that, but it seems that the embassy has pushed this over the line for us. So that's why we
We need your help. We need your help in a number of ways. We are trying, as you can see, to come out and make this presentation and have Barbara, with her amazing knowledge of the whole story, to come and speak to people and hopefully gain some connection. But really, we know you know people. And we know that you might have organizations that would like us to come and speak, or that might be able to assist us with grants or whatever. We are grateful for every donation we receive. We have a whole campaign going for that. Our current goal is $15,000 to get her back here. We have some stuff already given to us. The funeral home Found and Sons in Fredericksburg will be pro bono from Dulles to Hollywood Cemetery, which is a huge gift. But we don't have that ability to get that kind of gift in Paris. And so we have to pay for those expenses. We have ready to go, like on a moment's notice, we have a funeral home in Paris that is able to take care of those arrangements, works with Père Lachaise. So we have all those things in place, but we need to raise about $15,000 to get her back. And it's sounding like we can do that any old time. So if you're willing to help us, we're happy to have that. Most importantly, we have 3 missions. One is to bring her back. One is to repair her image, right? And then one is to send it forward and try to look at that in a larger way. The book clearly is establishing the proper credentials and the proper story. And these kinds of methods give us an opportunity to tell that story. But we still need to get her back. So if you can help in that way, or if you know people who can, talk to me afterwards. If you just want to know more about the story, or actually to just get Barbara's signature, she's got her books out there and she loves inscribing them to everybody. So we're prepared to help with that as well. But I think it's now, I'm going to stop talking and leave it back to you to answer any questions, or whichever questions you have for either one of us. Yeah.
Yes.
What happened to the friendship with Hortensia when Eliza comes back to Paris? Doesn't she
Sadly,
revitalize?
Hortense de Beauharnais had already died before Eliza went back. She died in 1837.
Yeah. Oh, wow.
And so that's another reason I think Eliza was writing to people like King Philippe, you know, because the people she had gone to school with there and the people that she had known when she was there in her younger days were gone by then. Yeah, it's a good question. Yes, ma'am.
What about the Hay family?
What about?
The Hay family, her husband's family.
Yes, that's interesting. When she married George Hay, he was a widower, and he had 2 children who were almost Eliza's age by that time. So there was a daughter and a son. You know, that's a good question. I'm wondering if they were alive when she died, because they were about her same age. I can check that, but that's a good question. And I don't know, I didn't find any correspondence to them. The other possibility that I had hoped would come through for her would have been her son-in-law, her daughter's husband, Lloyd Nicholas Rogers, and he was loaded. I did look into his finances, and when he died, his estate in Baltimore was worth, in today's money, about $32 million. So he was certainly in a position to help her. So why didn't he?
I mean, if she's writing to the Tsar of Russia, you know, where were these other people in her family?
Yeah, exactly. No, exactly. I agree. And maybe there are other letters, you know, that will turn up. They're in an attic someplace or something. You know, that's what happens with history. But there's also in her inventories, there was listed memoirs. Oh man, would I like to get that? But I've never heard of it. And I've asked around. Yeah, no one's ever heard of Eliza's memoirs. But wouldn't that questions for me or Sue?
I actually, not a question, but I wonder if you all have approached the DAR at all about helping
I just asked that,
financially?
they've gone to individual chapters, but they haven't gone to national yet.
Okay, because
So they need
I
to
would
go to
think,
national.
with Monroe's service in the American Revolution, I would think the
No, they,
DAR
yeah,
would
they,
like,
I just asked that, they
yeah.
said they would.
And if you can, afterwards,
They
if
just
you,
need to get to national.
yeah,
And not the-
and if you have any ideas about, I'd be happy to hear, afterwards about how to do that. I mean, we thought we'd just send out an email or have one of the other chapters we've spoken to maybe approach the main chapter, but yeah, that's a good idea. I think that would be.
I belong to
essential
the
at this
Taco
point.
chapter, and we would easily like to have you visit, but also we can, through our own state, region, et cetera, contact national.
Oh, wow.
That's usually how it works.
Oh, wow, that would be, we would be most grateful for, like I said, I didn't know anything about this kind of process. I went to one of my state representatives' office and I said, I want to bring home the remains of United States President and Founding Father, James Monroe, and where do I start? After he looked at me like, is this woman for real? If she, with a look on his face like, I don't know. But then he's helped guide me a little bit, because I didn't know what do I call the Secretary of State or something? I mean, where do you
leave it to
start?
the
But
DAR,
thank
right?
you.
DAR gets things done.
Yeah.
Are there any other questions? Yes?
You have a card that you put out on the table that if you wanted to get a hold and get some ideas in your direction, we would like you.
Yes, I have cards, and I can add my email on the back or whatever you
Put out there.
I just my playing cards, but I'm happy to give you my contact information. Yes, sir.
And checks are made payable to,
From the back.
For the donations?
yeah,
Oh, yes, it's in the brochure, the Historical Fredericksburg.
some of us didn't get those, we'll have to get those.
Historical Fredericksburg Foundation Incorporated, HFFI,
Okay, thank you.
is taking the.
Are those brochures out on your book table as well?
Yes, Sue has those ready, yes, and there's even a QR code that will connect you right away. We have a web page on their site, they are 503BC.
Yes.
This is why I have Sue. 503, so it's tax deductible.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, this was fantastic. So before you leave, just a reminder, we have our next winter talk is February 8th. If you don't get our emails, which we send out once a week, sometimes not even once a week, but that's a reminder of the programs that we have coming up. And then we have 2 more in March. So we have a sign-up sheet out there, we have a flyer out there for the February talk. And again, thank you so much for coming today.